She stood in her own doorway and watched a woman who'd taught her how to tie a ponytail at 5 years old ask for $5,000 a month like it was nothing. The rain made Vanessa's perfume run down the glass. The memory of abandonment ran deeper. The first call came on a Thursday morning, just as Michelle was locking her front door. "Michelle, it's Ethan. We need money fast." There was no hello, no warmth. Just the sharp demand of her younger brother's voice, a tone that scraped against her nerves like sandpaper. Michelle froze on the porch. It was barely 8 a.m., her workday already mapped out with back-to-back meetings. Ethan's voice, jittery with an edge of entitlement, dragged her backward into a history she had spent years trying to leave behind. "You make the most money, Michelle," he added, his words clipped. "It's only fair that you handle this yourself." Her jaw tightened. It wasn't the first time he'd said those words. They had become a refrain, an echo of her family's constant belief that her success was their safety net. "I can't keep bailing you out," Michelle replied, her voice steady but firm. "I have my own life to manage." There was silence, followed by a sigh of exaggerated frustration. "You've always been selfish. Mom said you'd never care about anyone but yourself." Guess she was right. The line went dead before Michelle could answer. For a moment, she just stood there, phone clutched in her hand, heart pounding. That one sentence was enough to shatter the fragile peace she'd been holding onto. Her mother's words, weaponized by Ethan, reached into old wounds that never fully healed. Michelle had built her life carefully, piece by piece, boundary by boundary. A solid career in finance, a tidy home on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, friends who respected her independence. She had no children, no husband, no messy entanglements. Just stability. And she guarded it with the vigilance of someone who had known chaos too well. But family had a way of finding cracks in her armor. It started small. An extra $200 here. A loan of $1,000 there. Promises to repay that never materialized. Each time, Michelle told herself it was the last. Each time, guilt, wrapped in her mother's old accusations, pulled her back in. This time felt different. Ethan's voice carried more than desperation. It carried something darker. A pressure that wasn't just about money. That night, Michelle's phone buzzed again. This time, a message. "We know you can afford it. Don't make us go public with what we have." Her breath caught. She read it again, her skin prickling. "Public? What we have." Text came from an unknown number. But the tone was familiar. Ethan, or Vanessa, his wife, had found a new weapon. By Saturday, things escalated. Michelle woke to a cascade of emails, alerts from her bank. Failed login attempts. Password resets she didn't initiate. Even her social media accounts bore signs of intrusion. Her fingers shook as she called the bank, verifying her identity for the 10th time that morning. "Yes, I'm Michelle Harper." "No, I did not request a wire transfer." "Yes, I've changed my password again." Someone was inside her life, clawing at the stability she had worked so hard to preserve. And she knew exactly who it was. That evening, as she sorted through a pile of unauthorized emails, her phone rang again. This time it was Vanessa, her sister-in-law. Her voice was sugar-sweet but laced with poison. "Michelle, we just need your help. A small contribution. You wouldn't want everyone knowing your private details, would you?" Michelle's chest tightened. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, come on," Vanessa laughed lightly, though the sound chilled Michelle to the bone. "We both know you wouldn't want certain things leaking. Family secrets. Finances. Your spotless reputation. Just help us out and this all goes away." For a moment, Michelle couldn't breathe. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was blackmail. And the betrayal was complete. Michelle stared out her window that night, the neighborhood bathed in quiet suburban calm. Kids played on bikes. A neighbor waved as he carried groceries inside. On the surface, it was all so normal. But inside her house, inside her heart, a storm raged. Her family wasn't just asking for help. They were threatening her, invading her, trying to strip away the one thing she had left, control. And Michelle knew then, she couldn't keep ignoring it. This wasn't about generosity or guilt anymore. This was a war. A war she hadn't asked for, but one she was now determined to fight. Michelle didn't sleep much that week. What rest she caught was hard and shallow, punctuated by the soft chirp of account alerts and the occasional phantom vibration of a phone she'd learned to check before bed. She turned her living room into a war room, laptop open, legal pads filled with neat lists, her phone tucked between a stack of banking statements and a well-worn photograph of her father at the diner. If Vanessa and Ethan thought terror was loud, they'd misread Michelle. Her weapons were small, precise, documentation, logic, and the stubborn patience of someone trained to follow a trail until the end. She began where all good investigations begin, with a careful audit. The bank's fraud unit gave her IP addresses and timestamps. Her company's IT security team ran forensic checks on the attempted logins to her work account. Aaron at the bank stayed on the line for hours while she watched him cross-reference a string of suspicious transfers. Martin Keller sat with her in the lawyer's windowless office and asked the clinical questions lawyers ask. What do you want, and how hard are you willing to push? Michelle's answer was steady. I want to stop. I want protection. And if they broke the law, I want consequences. She hesitated before the last word. And I want them to know they can't come back. Martin nodded. We'll get a protective order if the evidence supports it. If there's unauthorized access, that's a criminal matter. We'll coordinate with law enforcement so whatever they do next only makes the case stronger. Two things emerged from the data that night and tightened Michelle's throat. One, the failed logins and attempted transfers traced back to locations that matched Vanessa's hotel check-ins and to a cafe near the Westgate where Vanessa had said she was staying. Two, some of the devices used for the attempts were registered under an Ethan Grant email address, a detail that was sloppy enough to be useful and arrogant enough to be likely. Armed with coordinates, timestamps, and legal backing, Michelle decided to test a theory. Vanessa's reappearance was not a plea for reconciliation but a coordinated attempt to weaponize proximity and emotionality. They'd come to Austin knowing enough to probe her life. That made the stakes personal and premeditated. She started small and carefully. First, she cleaned up any literal points of entry. She installed a top-of-line doorbell camera and linked it to an encrypted cloud account. The old mailbox lock was replaced. She swapped out passwords until they were nonsense strings that wouldn't mean anything to someone betting on family trivia. Two-factor authentication she made mandatory wherever possible. Then she set the bait. Nancy from the bank recommended a monitored Honey account, a tiny, traceable holding account that looked unprotected to someone scanning for weak targets. The account was bait, low value but with routing that could expose attempts to siphon money. Aaron coordinated with a special fraud investigator and promised that any attempt would immediately ping his desk and the proper authorities. Meanwhile, Martin filed a motion to subpoena records for the suspicious IPs and devices. He advised caution. We don't want to spook them early, he said. Let them make a move. Let them incriminate themselves. But patience doesn't mean passivity. Michelle leveraged her work skills to build a defensive network. She had two junior analysts at Austin Cyber Solutions who owed her favors, Jenna and Marcus, and they spent 2 late nights building a discreet monitoring script that would alert her to any device or email address associated with Vanessa or Ethan attempting to touch her accounts. The script wasn't malicious, it was watchful. It was the cyber equivalent of keeping your eyes open at 3 a.m. One morning, as rain smeared the city into watercolor, a new variable arrived. Michelle's phone lit with a notification, a comment on Vanessa's tagged photo from someone she recognized, a man who'd once been close to Vanessa in Cleveland and who'd paid a high price years ago for trusting her. The comment was venomous in an odd, public way. "You always know how to find more marks. Thought you might try Austin next." The tone was not just observation, it was a thread pulling at a seam in Vanessa's past. She called Patricia right away. "Did she reach out to any of our relatives?" Michelle asked. Trisha's voice was shaky. "She's been reaching out all over, and not just us. I found a woman in Cleveland who said Vanessa conned her out of a car deposit 5 years ago." "Michelle, I'm sorry, I didn't know." The wall of evidence bulged. It had not been a single act of desperation. It was an assemblage of small, practiced cons that had accumulated into a pattern. Vanessa had used charm and nostalgia as currency. Ethan had learned the technical steps. Spoof and IP attempt transfers create emotional pressure. And now they'd tried to weaponize a daughter's career and reputation in a city where she'd carved a life. Michelle felt the familiar hunger for control edge into something colder, retribution that favored process over spectacle. She didn't want to ruin people for the sake of ruin. She wanted to be immutable, not prey, not easy pickings. If the law called for punishment, she'd let the law do its work. If it required humiliation so people would stop trusting someone with a history of theft, then let the humiliation be precise and factual, not performative revenge. She needed a plan that would do 3 things at once: protect her assets, expose the pattern, and reclaim the narrative, especially within their family and their social circles. Her first strategic strike was quiet. She arranged a meeting at a neutral place, a small municipal records office, with a woman who claimed to have been swindled by Vanessa years ago. The woman handed Michelle an old check with Vanessa's name scrawled on the memo line and a notarized statement. It was not enough for a criminal charge by itself, but it was an important brick in the structure of history. It also confirmed a suspicion that made the plan sharper. Vanessa had a pattern of small cons that were kept private through flattery, guilt, and the willingness of targets to be discreet. If records and official documents could make those cons visible, they would lose their power. While the legal muscle moved, Michelle took a second, bolder action. She crafted an email and walked into Copper Bean, where Vanessa had staged one of her more public scenes, and left the envelope on the barista station. Inside, an invite to a family mediation that listed Vanessa, Ethan, and their hotel as participants and requested documentation of their financial need. It was a provocation dressed as civility. Michelle knew Vanessa couldn't resist the optics of a family mediation. She was baiting Vanessa's penchant for public displays and orchestrated apologies. Vanessa took the bait. 2 days later, Vanessa sent a passive-aggressive message. "Michelle, I'm ready to talk. Let's do that mediation. Public would be best. Transparency is good for both of us." It was the performance Michelle had predicted. Vanessa wanted the camera. She wanted to put Michelle on stage and make her the villain for refusing to be moved. Michelle agreed, but under conditions. She wanted the mediation recorded, minutes taken, and witnesses in attendance. She insisted on a neutral mediator with legal credentials. Vanessa said yes too quickly. Meanwhile, Martin had quietly subpoenaed Vanessa's hotel records and Ethan's known devices, and Aaron had set the monitors to escalate any suspicious financial movement. Plan was not for theatrics that would humiliate out of malice. It was to let them show themselves in public and, with the law and facts present, for their performance to be measured by a ledger rather than by tears. The mediation day arrived like any public spectacle. A small room in a mediation center, fluorescent lights, an old coffee pot hissing in the corner. Vanessa arrived in a tight skirt and a blouse that read "Contrition," mascara smeared in the way that said she'd practiced vulnerability. Ethan trailed behind with the surly posture that yelled defenses. Michelle walked in with documents in a slim black folder and the coolness of someone whose life had been saved by method. The mediator, a retired family law judge Martin recommended, sat between them. A recording device sat on the table. The implicit theater made Michelle's hands itch. She let it. If they wanted a show, she would give a show of clarity. For 45 minutes Vanessa performed. She spoke of regrets, of hard times, of reconnecting for the sake of family. She used phrases that had worked for her in the past. We had struggles, it's time to heal. Money isn't everything. Ethan chimed in occasionally, his words flavored with threats thinly masked as suggestions. It'd be a shame if certain people knew what our dear Michelle had been hiding. The mediator asked for specifics. Vanessa's voice slipped. We need $4,500 a month to cover school and living in Chicago, she said. Ethan is promising but needs a push. The mediator asked, where will these funds be used? Do you have specifics on tuition, living? Vanessa floundered. She hadn't planned for document-based scrutiny. Michelle spoke then, slow, controlled. She didn't shout. She quelled fury in favor of fact. I have no legal obligation to pay for Ethan's tuition. I did not consent to any access of my accounts. I will not be blackmailed. If you persist with this, I will pursue every legal avenue available. Vanessa's face contorted in that familiar way, outrage adopted as armor. After everything I sacrificed, everything you sacrificed does not include rewriting my life or breaking the law. Michelle's voice was a cool blade. If you want reconciliation, we start with truth, and the first step of truth is you stop lying. Finn scowled. Vanessa's mascara made a streak like a comet across her cheek. Somewhere behind the mediator, a camera in the corner blinked twice. The recording was live. An hour later, outside the mediation room and inside the safe orbit of evidence, Martin leaned close. Good, he said softly. They tripped. They started claiming specifics but couldn't substantiate them. The subpoena's going to make their hotel logs and payment history look messy. Michelle felt the momentum shift in the air, like the first small gust that precedes a storm. Vanessa and Ethan were making the moves they always made, loud, emotional, improvisational, but this time the world listened to timestamps and receipts, not to sob stories. They drove off in their rented SUV after a tense goodbye. Vanessa's final look back was the kind that promised chaos. Ethan's last text to Michelle was the thinly veiled threat she'd expected. This will cost you. Think about your job. Michelle didn't flinch. She sat in her car and let the rain roll down the windshield. Martin was right. Their panic had made them bolder and sloppier. They thought they had the narrative. They didn't know she'd already started to collect everyone's receipts. At home, she opened the documentation folder and added the mediation transcript, the recorded audio, a copy of Vanessa's loose, unspecific financial plan, and the subpoena-confirmed hotel records. In the margin she wrote, "Pattern, not accident." Her phone buzzed, a new alert from the bank. Someone or something had attempted to test the Honey account. For a heartbeat she felt the old, raw adrenaline the animals surge. Then she smiled. The bank had intercepted the attempt and forwarded a trace. The IP address resolved, embarrassingly for them, to the cafe's guest Wi-Fi where Ethan had been splayed during the week. Trap was working. But as the coffee cooled, a different notification blinked at the top of her screen. A direct message to her professional LinkedIn account from an unknown address. The message was simple and clinical. Stop or your company will hear about your family issues. Attached, a screenshot of an internal company memo Michelle had never shared. Her throat went dry. The memo had confidential details only accessible to certain managers in HR. Someone had attempted to pull at the seam that connected her professionalism to her personal life. That detail shifted the stakes instantly. It wasn't just family and bank accounts anymore. Someone had attempted to penetrate her workplace systems. Michelle set her jaw. Pattern widened. This was not a domestic spat. It had metastasized into a campaign that threatened her reputation and career. She called Jenna and Marcus and sent them the screenshot. "Is this a leak or an attempted insertion?" she asked. Marcus replied within minutes. "It's staged. Metadata shows origin outside company. Someone fabricated the memo screenshot to look like an internal doc. But they're testing the waters. Will HR bite? Will management react?" "It's a gambit." Michelle breathed out slowly. They were skilled then. Or reckless. Either way, the stakes were higher. She looked at the recording of the mediation, at the Honey account alert, at the subpoenaed hotel log. She had them. But now she needed to move faster and smarter, not just to catch them in attempts at fraud, but to make the world see not a daughter withholding love but a pattern of premeditated theft and manipulation. She picked up the phone and dialed Martin. "We have to talk to HR and to public relations. This is escalating from private crime to reputation attack." His voice was calm. "We'll do both. And remember, let them make mistakes. They already have." She hung up and felt the peculiar, steadier hum of someone who had shifted from panic to action. The next move had to be precise, legal, and public enough that it would protect her and her career, but not so public it looked vindictive. There was an art to this. As the rain picked up and the city blurred in gray, Michelle sat back and began drafting an email she would send to HR, with attachment after attachment, with the mediation recording, with timestamps and subpoena confirmations. She would not ask for pity. She would ask for protection and transparency. Her finger hovered over the send button. She paused and looked at the photograph of her father. He had taught her how to balance the diner's books with methodical patience. He had taught her to count the cups of coffee and to never let the till be empty. She thought, "This is bookkeeping for my life. Keep the ledger accurate. Let the truth add up." She hit send. A single tone buzzed. An automated reply from HR confirmed receipt. Side thunder rolled. The next 12 hours would determine whether this campaign collapsed like bad weather or escalated into something that could touch her job. She braced herself to watch the storm from within, ready to steer it into the light. The first ripple arrived within an hour, an anonymous tip to Austin Cyber Solutions HR, a call claiming that Michelle's family drama had compromised her ability to do sensitive work. The line was dead before HR could confirm the caller. Her chest tightened for a second, then settled. It was expected, and it had been predicted. It was part of Vanessa's gambit. But then Jenna pinged. "We just traced the HR call." Came through a phone registered to Westgate, room 412. The hairs on Michelle's arms stood up. She looked at the mediation folder, then at the subpoenaed hotel logs, then at the Honey account alert. The net had closed tight enough to snag unskilled hands, but someone in room 412 had made all the wrong moves at the wrong time. She smiled despite herself. They were desperate. They were sloppy. And now, with legal, corporate, and law enforcement attention converging, the choice they made next would determine who looked guilty and who looked like the person who simply chose to keep living. The final ping of the night was different, a voicemail from her father. "Everything okay, kiddo?" he asked. Raymond's voice was steady as always, but there was an edge of worry she'd never heard before. "You sound locked in. Don't take it on yourself." Michelle touched the screen and replied with a short text. "Not alone. We've got them. Going to bed soon. Love you." She set the phone down and watched the city lights blink. A dozen small systems were in motion now, law, banking, IT, and a slow public record being built piece by piece. It would not be dramatic in the movies, she knew. It would be that other thing, slow attrition, patience, the kind of victory you measure with receipts. Beside her balcony, rain began to lessen. Inside, Michelle allowed herself a long breath. Then her phone buzzed again. An incoming call from an unlisted number. She answered before thinking. A voice, colder than she expected from Vanessa, said simply, "You don't know what you're getting ready to unleash, Michelle." People don't like being caught. Michelle studied, the reflexive surge of fear replaced by practiced calm. If you stop, we avoid more trouble. If you don't, the law takes longer, but it's thorough. There was a pause. "You think the judge will care about your receipts?" the voice asked. "You think people will believe you over a mother?" Michelle's voice was flat and final. "I have the receipts. I have witnesses. And I have the law on my side." The line went dead. Michelle looked at the recording that sat in her folder, at the Honey account alert, at the subpoenaed hotel logs, and at the HR notification. Lines connected and a map was forming. She was not naive about the escalation. She expected desperate moves now, louder threats, attempts to smear, maybe physical proximity. She had to be ready for all of it. She closed her laptop and let the night fall, the temporary lull before what she knew would be an inevitable storm of their own making. The trap had been set, now she had to wait and watch. The first strike had worked. She had evidence, legal counsel, and momentum. But detective work had a merciless truth. The person who acts first often reveals themselves. And in the next act, someone would make a mistake that would change everything. The morning after the HR call trace, the apartment felt smaller, as if every wall now listened. Michelle kept moving through rituals, coffee, inbox sweeps, a quick stand-up with her team, but she moved with the attention of someone who knew the strings attached to each step. Her calendar held meetings and motions. Her head held lists and evidence. The world outside still hummed with normalcy, joggers on the sidewalk, a delivery truck rattling by. Inside her life, mechanisms clicked. Martin filed the protective order that afternoon. Paperwork felt both bureaucratic and final. Names, dates, descriptions, a certified list of harassment and attempted access. The judge signed on procedural grounds after reviewing the exhibits Martin had assembled. Bank logs, subpoenaed hotel records, the mediation transcript, and the recorded voicemails. Vanessa reacted predictably, loud, outraged, theatrical. She posted a public plea on a platform that built scandals quickly and sympathetically. The post accused Michelle of turning her back on a mother who tried to do her best. Friends reached out, expecting sorrow. Michelle steeled herself and added one more item to Martin's folder, screenshots of the post and the ensuing replies. It was only when the state cyber unit took interest that the campaign shifted from civil to criminal. An officer named Lieutenant Ana Rios, precise, matter-of-fact, a woman who had the look of someone who'd seen every human excuse for wrongdoing, called Michelle in for a statement. She listened without blinking as Michelle recited the arc of events, the fingerprints of login attempts, the Honey account test, the mediation snafu, the HR smear. "We'll want to talk to Ethan," Lieutenant Rios said, folding her hands. "If this traces to devices registered in his name and you have the mediation recording, that's a good start. We can get warrants for the devices in Cleveland and for the Westgate's Wi-Fi logs." She slid a card across. "We'll take it from here. Don't post about it publicly. Let the process run." Michelle nodded. For someone trained to trust in systems, the law acted like another set of protocols. She felt relief, not of triumph but of forward motion. Investigation meant something would land where it belonged. 2 days later, the arrest unfolded as it always did in real life, quietly, bureaucratically, and with the inevitability of an axe falling. Ethan was taken at the cafe where he'd often loitered, earbuds in, posture casual. An officer read him his rights. He looked surprised and then furious in a way that seemed thin and performative. Vanessa's calls came through the line in rapid succession, panic then anger, alternating like a hiss. "Raymond, you have to do something," Vanessa cried when she managed to reach their father. "He's my son." Raymond, exhausted and clear-eyed, did the arithmetic of loyalty he'd done 1,000 times. "You made your bed," he said tightly. "You come to my daughter and ask for money and then try to break her accounts? I'll be there, but don't expect me to lie." The arrest created a rupture in the family's supply of plausible deniability. Cousins who had seen Vanessa's pattern, the payments that disappeared, the friendly favors that turned into debts, started to call with new hesitance. A few offered cautious apologies. Others stayed silent. Vanessa lashed out, then retreated, and the narrative drugged through both sympathy and suspicion. Michelle kept to her routines: hearings, HR meetings, interviews with Lieutenant Rios. The state's cyber team pulled phone records and device logs. They traced attempted logins from Ethan's known devices and from a Wi-Fi router at Westgate Room 412. Probable cause memo became weighty. It was, to her trained eye, a tidy knot of causality, attempts plus motive plus means. Then came a call that opened an unexpected door. It was from Patricia, Vanessa's sister, whose voice had acquired a brittle edge. "Michelle, there's something else. You should sit down." She did. Patricia told her about a man named Lucas, a man Michelle had once known dimly through her father, a man who'd helped Raymond at the diner during busy seasons. Lucas had been a neighbor in Cleveland, a steady sort, the kind of person who fixed things for a living and knew how to keep a ledger in his head. Patricia's voice faltered. "He called me. He said he saw Vanessa and Ethan in the grocery when he was in town last month. He said he heard them talking about you, but not the way you've heard it. He said Vanessa mentioned someone at your company by name, like she had a contact there. He felt weird about it." Michelle's mind snagged on the phrase, "mentioned someone at your company by name." She thought of the fabricated LinkedIn screenshot and the HR call routed from Westgate. She thought of how the smear had been surgical and targeted. Whoever had pulled it off had knowledge beyond family scraps. Whoever had made that screenshot had known what would sting. Tricia went on. "Lucas said he'd given Vanessa a little money once. He thought she was trying to get back on her feet. He said later she sent him to call a number to see if someone at your company would respond to a fabricated HR complaint. He said she paid him small cash just to make a call. He thought it was harmless. He didn't know they'd make a pattern." Michelle felt a sudden mix of anger and pity at the name of Lucas. A man who'd been kind for decades had been twisted into a tool. Lucas's involvement explained a critical vector. Vanessa had used networks of favors and small debts, people who owed her a kindness, to reach beyond her social circle. The smear wasn't purely digital and family-based. It was an old-fashioned web of small compromises. Vanessa had a Rolodex of favors. She'd used them. Lieutenant Rios listened to Patricia's statement and took Lucas's name seriously. He was interviewed, and his call logs corroborated Patricia's account. He admitted making a call, trembling as he explained he had not understood the scope, that he thought he was helping a woman in trouble. He hadn't realized the call would be routed to HR while claiming to be from someone within the company. He'd been an instrument of a larger scheme. The realization was horrific in two ways. 1. Vanessa had more reach than Michelle had assumed. 2. Vanessa's tools included people Michelle had once considered neutral or harmless. When the prosecutor's office compiled the case, they included Lucas's testimony as part of the pattern of inducement and deception. Ethan's arrest drew attention to Vanessa's methods. Vanessa's attempts to claim innocence and to peddle the story of a sorrowful mother were undermined by cash flows and call logs that told the opposite story, a pattern of premeditated manipulation. But the law isn't the only jury. The human cost of these legal motions was a different ledger. Lucas called Michelle, voice low and ashamed. He wanted to apologize in a way that meant more than words. Are you okay?" he asked. "I didn't know. I'm sorry." She heard someone trying to do the right thing after having done the wrong one. She could have fulminated, made him pay. Instead, she promised to meet him, to listen. It was one of those choices that felt like mercy and strategy at once, to hold the circle of harm open enough for repentance and closed enough for justice. Days later, the prosecutor announced charges beyond the cyber unit's initial scope: attempted theft, harassment, and coercion. The city's DA framed the case as a textbook example of how emotional manipulation can be used in modern schemes. Vanessa's posts, once sympathetic, started to look like an attempt to muddy a legal record. Media attention nudged the story into local news cycles. Sometimes the camera wanted drama, sometimes it wanted facts. Michelle made a deliberate choice. She would not play for cameras. She authorized transcripts and allowed certain public facts, but she refused to feed spectacle. She had seen how Vanessa used theater before. She wouldn't hand her the stage. Not everyone agreed. Cousins wanted Michelle to go on a morning show to clear the air. Patty called, tearful. "They say awful things, Michelle. People think you're cruel." Michelle listened and refused. "The truth is in the papers and in the records," she told her aunt. "I don't need to perform sorrow for a lie." Midway through a particularly grinding week of depositions and HR strategy calls, a new message arrived that threatened to flip everything. It was an anonymous tip. A woman had alleged that Michelle had, years ago, accepted a settlement from an ex-employer that included a confidentiality clause. The rumor was false, but the tactic was old. Plant a rumor. Seed doubt. Make the person who defends their reputation feel like they are hiding something. Martin called it exactly what it was: a smear campaign. "They're trying to equalize the ledger by making everyone's trust smaller," he said. "We keep pushing facts. Don't get dragged into the narrative war." But the hit. One late night, Michelle found herself rereading old emails, scanning contracts for any clause that could be spun. She felt vulnerable in the way that exposure creates. She'd never thought of herself as a person whose past could be weaponized. The realization put a heavy hand on her chest. She took a step she had promised herself she would take only if it was true. She cleared her history, posted a brief factual statement on her professional page. Not a plea but a record. "I am cooperating with law enforcement. I have provided records and evidence regarding attempts of unauthorized access and harassment from named parties. I will not be commenting further while legal proceedings continue." She meant the sentence as a shield. Others read it as defiance. Vanessa answered in kind with a long social post claiming injury and demanding reconciliation. Michelle watched the comments thread swarm with people choosing sides, empathy, and assumptions. It was draining in a way that made her nostalgic for the clean lines of code she used to write. Deterministic, logical, unambiguous. And then came the emotional low. 3 a.m, she woke to a faint sound at her door. The doorbell had been disabled after the initial break-ins. The biometric lock and cameras should have been more than enough. She checked the feed and saw nothing. She could have stayed in bed and called the police. Martin and Lieutenant Rios would have responded. But the sound had the quality of someone outside the door who wanted to be noticed, a soft thud that felt almost like a plea. She opened the camera stream and zoomed. A figure was there, someone too small to be Vanessa, too slight to be Ethan. A child? She couldn't tell. A paper bag sat by the door with a note pinned on top. Camera couldn't pick up the handwriting. She hesitated, then wrapped a sweater around herself and went to the door. Outside stood a teen she recognized from the local community college, someone who'd been in the coding mentorship group she'd started months earlier. The boy's cheeks were raw from the cold. He looked terrified. In his hands he held the paper bag. Inside, a few cans, a half-eaten sandwich. He thrust the bag into her hands. "I thought maybe you'd need this," he said, voice small. They said not to trust people. But Mrs. Wilson said you help people." Her chest loosened in a way that surprised her. Here was a kid who had nothing to do with family feuds, who had heard gossip and still decided to do something small and kind. She invited him in, gave him hot chocolate, and listened as he told her that his mother had lost work hours, that rumors had made people nervous, that he'd been ashamed to ask for help but proud to help in small ways. The moment grounded her. This was what mattered, real people living real lives. The rest was noise. She could have made the choice at that point to go public with every detail, to shout down Vanessa, to make a spectacle that would burn the memory from every mind. But she remembered Lieutenant Rios's advice, let the process run. She remembered Martin's steady hand. She remembered the boy's small act and how real kindness was not performative. Instead, she called the DA's office and told them about the anonymous smear. She offered them the new evidence, Lucas's testimony, the mediation transcript, the hotel logs, the HR call trace. She told them about the note at her door and the kid with the sandwich. She pressed her face to the facts and kept her mouth closed for the rest. The week that followed moved into its own cadence. Ethan's arraignment was scheduled. Vanessa's attorney filed motions to dismiss certain exhibits. The court scheduled hearings. Martin prepared for trial, meticulous and cold, and Lieutenant Rios kept the pressure on. Michelle felt the weight of months of vigilance settle into something more sustainable, a life that still had chapters beyond legal motions. She taught a class one evening, showing teenagers the basics of two-factor authentication. Kids were earnest and hungry to learn. One of them, the boy who'd left the sandwich, asked if she really hated her mother. She thought about the files on her desk and the phone calls with her father and what hate meant in a ledger of abandonment. She smiled and said, I am learning to choose what I will allow into my life. That night, she locked her door, the biometric scanner clicking into place. She lay awake a little longer than usual, not because of fear but because decisions still had edges. She had chosen a path that did not seek revenge for spectacle. She had chosen evidence and law. She had chosen boundaries. The choice would make enemies and allies, but in the end it might save her life, and perhaps the lives of others who would be tempted by charm and guilt to give up more than they could afford. Outside, the city breathed. Inside, Michelle exhaled. The case would continue to unfold, but she had started something that mattered. A system had been set in motion that would, if she and the law did their parts, stop a pattern and protect others. The storm had not yet ended. But she had a roof, a plan, and a mind that would not be fooled. Courthouse smelled the way courts always did, lemon cleaner, old upholstery, and institutional calm that had nothing to do with human feelings. Michelle had been in courtrooms before, giving testimony in technical matters for her company, but never about her life. Still, the ritual steadied her. Folders, exhibits, Martin's quiet nod, her father's hand in hers like an anchor. Vanessa arrived with a different kind of armor, rehearsed grief, a wardrobe chosen to broadcast contrition. Ethan's eyes were hollow and red-rimmed. The theater of being wronged had become a job in itself. Press clustered outside the courthouse doors like flies around a spill. Local reporters had sniffed the human drama in the legal filings and fed the story into glossy bites. Estranged daughter versus clever mother, read one headline. Another asked, is it blackmail or a family fight? Inside courtroom 4, Judge Williams held a kind of concentrated patience. She listened to Martin lay out the pattern. Failed logins traced to devices connected to Westgate Room 412, recorded voicemails, subpoenaed hotel receipts, and the mediation transcript where Vanessa's demands slid into vague financial entreaties. Lieutenant Rios presented the cyber unit's traces with the clinical thoroughness of someone translating code into human consequence. Vanessa's counsel tried a different track, humanize her. They described years of hardship, emotional illness, a woman trying to reconcile. She's not a criminal, the attorney argued. She's a mother who lost her way and is asking for her child's help. Martin's retort was surgical. Asking for help is not asking for access, he said. Asking for help does not include attempts to hijack accounts, to route calls through third parties, or to fabricate documents. The record shows a pattern of premeditated acts intended to coerce. The judge's gavel came down on procedural points, and the hearing moved slowly like a tide. The media cameras blinked. Vanessa's face folded into practiced anguish. What no one anticipated was the quiet, steady march of evidence outside the theatrics. Aunt Patty's call, the notarized checks from Patricia, Lucas's reluctant testimony, and the quiet confirmations from the bank and IT logs. Each new paper filing shifted the calculus of sympathy. People who'd once blinked at Vanessa's tearful posts began to notice the shape of the receipts. The public's mood is a fickle thing, and facts can cool even the hottest pity. As the days inched forward, Vanessa grew thinner in public presence. Her social posts turned from theatrical outrage to defensive, then to thinly veiled resentment. She blamed the court, then Michelle, then the system. The old script, blame everyone for her failures, grew stale. At home in Cleveland, cousins who once passed her checks quietly pulled their support. The social well she had tapped for so long began to dry. Then came the twist that changed the courtroom's tone. Patricia took a stand. She had been tentative for weeks, caught in the old loyalty to sister bind. But as she watched Vanessa's pattern play out and as the truth of small cons emerged, something shifted. She walked into the clerk's office and signed an affidavit, detailing instances of loans never expected to be repaid and small favors that were repurposed into debt. In court, she faced Vanessa's stunned look and read from a list of dates and amounts. Vanessa's face, at first blank with fury, crumpled into a confusion that looked, for the first time, like remorse. It was not dramatic. It was private and ugly and real. Patricia's choice to testify was a turning point. The family fold that had been complicit in silence began to fray. Cousins who had been sympathetic now hummed with uncertainty. It was one thing to feel sorry for a woman in trouble. It was another to confront how many people that woman had used to prop herself up. The media smelled blood and pivoted. Coverage shifted from family feud to pattern of exploitation. Journalists who had once framed the story as a sympathetic mother began asking harder questions about co-signed loans, defaulted debts, and a trail of small victims. The tide of public empathy ebbed. Vanessa's defenses sharpened into anger. In private, she raged at Patricia. "How could you?" she demanded, voice thin with fury. "You'll ruin me." Patricia's answer was small and unadorned. "I can't keep lying for you, V, not when I know." Another unexpected alliance formed slowly and quietly. Mrs. Wilson, the elderly neighbor who had been the first to warn Michelle about mailbox peeking, became more than a witness. She became an advocate. Her voice had once been an aside. Now it carried moral weight. She spoke to a local reporter about what she had seen. "I saw them trying handles, peeking in windows. I said something because I thought it was wrong." The reporter's piece, short and gentle, humanized Michelle anew, not as a cold career woman but as a neighbor protecting a community. Small human details matter in a city of strangers. Amid the courtroom whirl, Ethan's own unraveling was quietly more destructive than Vanessa's theatrical collapses. Once arrested, once presented with the possibility of real consequences, the bravado dissolved into brittle panic. At arraignment, he refused televised interviews. His stoic posture cracked, and he pleaded guilty to one count of attempted unauthorized access as part of a plea deal that sought to limit the collateral damage. The plea carried with it requirements, community service, cyber ethics classes, and a suspended sentence contingent on restitution efforts. For the first time, Ethan faced a ledger with numbers he could not charm away. Vanessa watched her son take the fall and, in a moment that shocked some family members, she faltered publicly. The woman who had once weaponized mother into an instrument of entitlement now had to sit with consequences that hit her where she was most vulnerable. In the story she'd told herself for years, that she had no hand in the ruin she left behind. The legal process was not immediate catharsis. For Michelle, there were hearings, deposition fatigue, and a quiet emotional drain that showed up in odd ways. sleeplessness, a sudden need for control that she noticed in the way she arranged salt shakers on her counter. But the facts accrued like bricks, and the foundation the opposition had built began to crack. Outside the courtroom, the emotional landscape shifted too. A small, unexpected ally appeared in the most unlikely place. Vanessa's estranged second husband, someone Michelle had never met but who had been in Vanessa's orbit years ago, reached out to Michelle's counsel. He had information, he said, about Vanessa's past debts and certain transactions. He wasn't morally heroic. He had his own reasons, old grievances, a wish to ensure his name wasn't dragged into the mess. But the data he provided, bank transfers, the names of individuals who had been coaxed into co-signing, helped tie together several loose threads in the prosecutor's pile. Martin was cautious. "We don't take ambiguous help," he said. "We vet it. But if it stands up, it helps the pattern." The husband's evidence did pass the smell test, corroborated by bank stamps and dates that matched the small claims Patricia had mentioned. It was not vengeance masquerading as aid. It was an unexpected piece of the puzzle that fitted. Vanessa's micro-world began to close in. She stopped making big public pronouncements and retreated into private calls. Court's narrative, once a mere procedural loop, hardened into a public record that stated plainly what Michelle had always known on a cold factual level. The actions were planned, repeated, and instrumental. Amid the legal storms, something quieter was happening to Michelle. Her life was not defined by the courtroom alone. She taught a Saturday class to a roomful of teenagers hungry for the kind of competence that built futures. She took Raymond to a diner that had been offered a buyer. She accepted a simple bouquet from Mrs. Wilson, a small, unself-conscious token of neighbor care. These anchors mattered. They were the human stakes beyond the ledger. And then the unexpected, sharp emotional moment that made everything feel both smaller and larger. At a closed-door hearing, Vanessa's attorney, desperate, offered a settlement. Not to hush the crimes, but to pay a restitution amount necessary to cover some of the attempted transfers and to avoid a lengthy public trial. The offer was calculated: avoid trial, limit public spectacle, and keep certain records sealed through a civil agreement. Martin looked at Michelle across the table. Raymond sat with his jaw clenched. Choice was a moral and strategic decision that felt like deciding whether to amputate a limb to save the body. "You can take the settlement and be done," Martin said quietly. "Or you can continue and let the prosecutors pursue criminal charges. There are pros and cons either way." Michelle felt the pull of old resentments, an urge to see Vanessa exposed fully, to let the public record be a moral reckoning. But she also felt the pull of something else, the woman who had taught her to keep receipts, who had taught her that the world often required practical choices rather than the satisfying sweep of dramatic ruin. She looked at her father. Raymond's eyes were steady. "You get to decide what justice looks like for you," he said. "Not the court. Not the papers." It was not an abdication of duty. It was a calibration of consequences. She could let the system grind, letting time and pain do what they might, or she could accept restitution that would ensure certain outcomes now, protection and acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a measure of financial accountability. The settlement also carried risk. Vanessa could slip away with a quiet payment and keep repeating her patterns elsewhere. Michelle sat for a long time and thought of the teenagers in her class, of Lucas's shaking apology, of Aunt Patty's tired voice, of Mrs. Wilson's cookies on a rainy afternoon. She thought about boundaries, how they weren't just walls but also choices to conserve what mattered. "I want accountability," she said finally. "And I want it to be public enough that it protects others. But I don't want to feed a spectacle. If a settlement achieves restitution and admission and court-enforceable supervision, then maybe that's enough." It was not a dramatic choice. It was not a triumphant moment in a movie. It was a careful, weary decision made by someone who had learned the cost of rage and the power of evidence. Martin nodded, the lines around his eyes folding with approval. Outside the courthouse, a reporter asked Michelle if she had anything to say. She declined. "The record will say what needs to be said," she told him. That evening at home, she opened the fridge and found a small container of Mrs. Wilson's lemon bars. She smiled, and for a minute the legal noise felt like a distant storm. There would be hearings, restitution agreements, supervised payments, and perhaps probation. There would also be a public record with a judge's order and enforceable terms. The settlement would not erase the past, but it would erect guardrails that might protect the people Vanessa would otherwise target. As she closed her folder and turned off her lamp, she felt fatigue like a heavy, honest thing. She'd traded fury for structure, spectacle for consequence. Felt oddly and finally like choosing a life. The settlement conference ended not with fireworks but with signatures and typed stipulations. A civil agreement was filed, restitution payments from Vanessa and Ethan under court supervision, a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing entered into the record, and restrictions on further contact. Judge Williams made it clear the order carried teeth. Any breach would reactivate criminal charges. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't revenge. It was structure. Michelle walked out of courtroom 4 into the crisp air of early spring and felt, for the first time in months, a horizon that stretched beyond subpoenas. Courthouse steps were filled with press. She kept her eyes forward. No statement. No performance. She let Martin handle the questions, and his voice carried the authority of fact. The matter is resolved under terms that provide accountability and protection. That is all we will say. Vanessa's decline unfolded quietly. Restitution meant selling assets she had clung to, furniture, jewelry, the leased car she flaunted. Her public presence dimmed. Friends who once posted supportive emojis now turned away. The money that once fueled short-lived stability was gone, replaced by court-monitored disbursements. Finn, stuck in his plea deal, attended cyberethics classes and picked up shifts at a grocery store. He avoided eye contact when he spotted Michelle at a cafe one Saturday. For the first time, his bravado was replaced with silence. Michelle didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Punishment was in the ordinary consequences, the slow erosion of old patterns, the stripping away of easy excuses. Vanessa still called sometimes, leaving voicemails that veered from pleading to bitter. Michelle never answered. The court order gave her protection, but the real barrier was her choice. Each silence was its own victory. Raymond, for the first time in years, exhaled. "I don't have to choose anymore," he said one evening at the diner as they split a slice of pie. "I used to think being a father meant covering everyone's tracks. But maybe it means telling the truth about who they are." Michelle reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You don't have to cover anyone anymore. You just get to live." Life began to widen again. Michelle poured her energy into the mentorship program she had started half a year earlier. Every Saturday, she met a group of teenagers in the library's tech lab, kids who had grown up with smartphones but knew little about how systems actually worked. She taught them coding basics, walked them through phishing examples, showed them how to build secure passwords. One afternoon, she asked them to run a simple ethical hack on a test website she'd set up. They giggled as they found holes, cheered when they broke through, then listened rapt as she explained why those holes mattered in the real world. She told them in careful terms that people sometimes use the same tricks not for fun but for harm. "And that's why you need to learn to defend yourselves and others," she said. The boy who had once left a bag with a sandwich on her doorstep raised his hand. "Is that why you don't talk to your mom anymore?" "Because she tried to use the tricks." The room went silent. Michelle felt her throat tighten, but she answered honestly. "Yes." She tried. "And sometimes the hardest part is that she's still my mom. But you don't have to let someone hurt you, even if you love them. Especially if you love them." The room stayed quiet, the weight of her words sinking into young shoulders. Then one girl said softly, "My uncle does that too. He always says I owe him." "I don't like it." Michelle nodded. "You don't owe anyone your safety. Ever." It was the most important lesson she could give them, more important than code. At work, Michelle's reputation had not only survived the smear attempt, it had grown stronger. HR, once cautious, publicly commended her for her cooperation during the investigation. Her manager quietly hinted that her name was being floated for a director role. When an industry magazine asked to profile her, she hesitated. But this time she agreed, with one condition: the article would highlight her mentorship program, not her family drama. The piece was titled "From Firewalls to Futures: One Woman's Mission to Teach Resilience." It was about code, kids, and community. Vanessa's name never appeared. Michelle had reclaimed the narrative by refusing to make it about betrayal. One evening, Michelle stood on her balcony as the sun set over the skyline. The city glowed, busy and alive. She sipped tea and thought about the long year, about the letters, the lies, the subpoenas, the settlement. She thought about her younger self, the girl who had once begged for approval, who had written checks just to keep the peace. That girl was gone. Now she had something else, a life defined not by who demanded from her but by what she chose to build. She had her father, her neighbor, her students. She had boundaries. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future not in reaction to others but as a deliberate creation. She thought about writing a guidebook for teens about digital safety. She thought about buying the diner with her father, turning it into a place where community and tech workshops could coexist. She thought about love, real love, not obligation dressed as family but something she might choose for herself one day. The scars remained. Vanessa's voice still haunted her dreams sometimes. Ethan's betrayal still stung. But they no longer defined her. Michelle breathed in the cool air and whispered to herself, "This is my life. Mine." The city lights twinkled as if in agreement. The final confrontation didn't come in a courtroom. Came on a rainy Tuesday, nearly a year after the settlement. Michelle was leaving her office when she spotted a familiar figure waiting by the building's entrance, Vanessa. Her mother looked thinner, her once polished style reduced to a worn coat and shoes that had seen better days. She wasn't destitute, but the shine was gone. Her eyes carried the same mix of defiance and desperation Michelle had seen since childhood. "Michelle," Vanessa said, her voice trembling. I just need 5 minutes. Please." Michelle paused, umbrella in hand, her coworkers streaming past. She could have ignored her, walked away. But something in her had shifted. She no longer felt fear, not even anger. Just clarity. 5 minutes, Michelle said, her voice calm. "And then I'm leaving." They stepped under the awning, rain pattering above them. Vanessa's words came in a rush. "They've cut me off, everyone. Your aunt won't speak to me. The settlement took everything. I'm drowning, Michelle. I need your help. Just until I get back on my feet." Michelle met her gaze, unflinching. "You had help. 4 years. Every time you lied, every time you stole, I gave you help. And you turned it into another weapon." Vanessa's face twisted. "I'm your mother. Don't you understand? You wouldn't even have the life you do without me. You owe me." The old words. The familiar trap. But this time Michelle smiled, not with cruelty but with release. "No, Mom. I don't owe you. I never did. And I'm not your safety net anymore." Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed. For once, she had no script, no venom sharp enough to pierce Michelle's armor. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of rain. Michelle took a breath. "I wish you peace. But you'll have to find it without me." She turned and walked away, her steps steady, her heart unburdened. Behind her, Vanessa didn't follow. The storm swallowed her figure until she was just another shadow in the city. In the weeks that followed, Michelle felt lighter. Nights were no longer haunted by guilt. She invested more deeply in her mentorship program, securing a small grant from a local foundation. With the money, she expanded classes, bought better equipment, and even hired her first assistant, a college student who had once been her mentee. Raymond's health improved as well. Freed from constant conflict, he started playing piano again at the diner on weekends, filling the space with music that reminded Michelle of her childhood before the fractures. On a quiet Sunday, Michelle hosted her mentorship students at the diner. They huddled around laptops, laughing, coding, building projects that might one day carry them into futures brighter than hers had been at their age. Watching them, she felt something rare, pride not weighed down by someone else's need to diminish it. One of the teens looked up and asked, "Why do you spend so much time with us? You could be doing bigger things." Michelle smiled. "This is the biggest thing I'll ever do. Because if you learn how to protect yourselves now, you'll never let anyone make you feel powerless. And that's worth more than any job title." Kids nodded, their eyes reflecting the lesson, not just about technology but about life. Months later, Michelle received the promotion. Director of Cybersecurity Initiatives. A role that meant more responsibility, more visibility, and more influence. She accepted, not for prestige but for purpose. She knew she could use her platform to advocate for broader community protections, to expand programs like the one she'd started. The celebration dinner, Martin raised his glass. "To Michelle," he said, "who proved that resilience is the best revenge." Everyone clinked glasses, laughter filling the room. Michelle looked around at the faces, her father, her friends, her colleagues, and realized she wasn't defined by the family she lost, but by the one she had built. That night, alone on her balcony again, she thought back to the girl she had been when it all started, frightened, manipulated, convinced she was nothing without her mother's approval. Now she understood the truth. Vanessa's downfall wasn't her victory. Her victory was choosing a life free of Vanessa's chains. A life where her worth wasn't measured by sacrifice but by the strength she carried forward. Michelle whispered into the night sky, her voice steady and certain. "They said I was nothing without her. Now I'm more powerful than ever." The city lights flickered back, as if the universe itself agreed.